When did being right feel like losing everything? I was Googling my sister's new boyfriend when I found the obituary of his ex-wife. She apparently fell down the stairs at home with no witnesses. Just a few months ago, my sister Charlotte had started dating Mark, and he was everything our parents dreamed of. Head of cardiology, Johns Hopkins medical degree, waterfront condo. The first time I saw them together should have been my warning. Mark arrived with $300 wine, complimented Mom's overcooked roast, and laughed at Dad's inappropriate jokes. But he also watched Charlotte when she spoke, and his hand tightened on her shoulder when she laughed too loud. 2 weeks later, I saw finger-shaped bruises wrapped around Charlotte's forearm. Tennis lessons, Mark explained smoothly. She grips the racket hard. Charlotte nodded and quickly pulled her sleeve down. Very soon, Charlotte was wearing turtlenecks during Texas summers and missing girls' nights. When I drove to their apartment to check on her, it was always Mark who answered. And he always had explanation. Endometriosis. New medication. She needs rest. When I found out about Mark's late wife's death, I stayed up researching into the night. That one obituary led me to a dead woman in Seattle, who led me to another dead woman in Boston. All these women were married to Mark, and all had million-dollar life insurance policies that I found through public records and obituary notices. My eyes went wide. I compiled everything into a folder as proof, but my parents wouldn't even look at it. Photoshop, Dad said. He warned us you might do this, Mom added, not meeting my eyes. 2 weeks later, Charlotte and Mark had their engagement party at the country club. I hadn't seen Charlotte in months, but when I did, I had to double take. She'd lost over 30 pounds. Her collarbones jutted out like bird wings above her designer dress. When I tried to pull her aside, Mark appeared instantly, his hand possessive on her waist. Tell her about Tiana, I suddenly said, my voice carrying across the sudden silence. My late wife died in an accident, he replied calmly. Get out! Charlotte screamed, but her eyes were pleading something different. Security escorted me past 200 guests while Mom told everyone I was drunk again. The story Mark had planted, the reputation he'd crafted for me. The days blurred together as the wedding approached. I hired a private investigator with my last savings, documented everything, called police departments across 3 states. But Mark was on hospital boards, donated to campaigns, had connections that made my evidence disappear into bureaucratic black holes. His mistake came 1 week before the wedding. His assistant called our house about life insurance paperwork. $1 million taken out without Charlotte's knowledge, just like the others. The wedding day arrived with obscene grandeur. 400 guests, the governor attending, a string quartet playing in the hotel's marble lobby. I found Charlotte in the bridal suite, staring at her reflection like she was already attending her own funeral. I know about the insurance policy, I whispered. Her face went white beneath the professionally applied makeup. 5 minutes alone, she said suddenly. Please, before I become Mrs. Hastings. Everyone filed out, leaving her with her ghosts. 5 minutes became 20. Then I saw the water seeping under the bathroom door. Pink water. The chair was heavy in my hands as I swung it at the door. The crack of wood echoed like a gunshot. Inside, Charlotte floated in the bathtub, wedding dress spreading like white wings in the pink water. Empty digoxin bottles bobbed like toy boats. He put it in my champagne, she whispered when her eyes fluttered open. Mark ran when the police mentioned Seattle, caught in the parking lot with 3 passports and 3 sets of medical licenses. The trial revealed 7 dead wives across 15 years, all accidents with insurance payouts. Charlotte barely survived. The doctor said 10 more minutes would have been too late. My parents send checks for her therapy but won't visit. Their shame is a living thing that sits between us at every family gathering we no longer have. The last text from Mom simply read, "We just wanted her to marry well." He put it in my champagne, Charlotte whispered. But then she said something else. Something about Mark that made my blood freeze. Because Charlotte knew. She'd known all along. And she'd been playing a game I never saw coming. Charlotte's eyes locked onto mine from the hospital bed, and she grabbed my hand with more strength than I thought she had left. She pulled me close and whispered that she'd been recording Mark for 3 months using a tiny device she'd hidden in her purse. Her fingers were cold as she explained she'd found out about his first wife's death the same way I had, but by then Mark had already cut her off from everyone. She couldn't run because he tracked her phone and car and had cameras in their apartment that he said were for security. I sat down hard in the visitor's chair as the room started spinning around me. Charlotte kept talking fast like she needed to get it all out before someone stopped her. She told me she'd decided her only chance was to play along and pretend to be the perfect victim while secretly gathering proof that might save her life. She'd smile when he hurt her and apologize when he got angry, and all the while she was recording everything. Her voice cracked as she described finding Tiana's obituary online one night when Mark was at the hospital. She'd known right then that she was living with a killer, but if she ran, he'd find her and make it look like an accident just like the others. Detective Matthews knocked on the door then, and Charlotte's whole body went rigid until she saw his badge. He introduced himself and said he needed her statement about what happened at the wedding. Charlotte reached under her hospital blanket and pulled out something small wrapped in plastic. It was a USB drive she'd sewn into the lining of her wedding dress weeks ago just in case. She handed it to him with shaking hands and told him it had everything. The detective plugged it into his laptop right there in the room, and his face went white as he listened through headphones. He kept stopping to write notes and looking at Charlotte like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. After 10 minutes, he pulled out his phone and called someone saying they needed to expand the investigation immediately. He played one recording on speaker, where Mark's voice came through clear as day, talking to someone about how Charlotte wouldn't last past the honeymoon just like Tiana did. The detective said this changed everything, and asked Charlotte if she had more evidence. She nodded and told him about the journal in her safety deposit box, and the photos on her cloud storage that Mark didn't know about. Matthews called for backup to guard Charlotte's room, and started making more calls to the prosecutor's office. The next morning, Clarissa Haynes arrived in a sharp suit carrying a thick folder. She sat down and explained that Charlotte's recordings were exactly what they needed to upgrade the charges against Mark. With this evidence, they could pursue attempted murder with special circumstances, which meant Mark might never get out of prison. She asked Charlotte to walk her through everything from the beginning, while a court reporter typed every word. Charlotte talked for 2 hours straight about the bruises and the threats, and the way Mark would test her by mentioning his dead wives. Clarissa took notes and asked careful questions, and by the end she said they had enough to bury Mark in court. The hospital assigned 2 security guards to stand outside Charlotte's room after Clarissa warned that Mark might have friends we didn't know about. I started sleeping in the chair next to Charlotte's bed because I was too scared to leave her alone even with the guards there. Every noise in the hallway made us both jump, and Charlotte barely slept at all those first few nights. On the 3rd day, our parents finally showed up, but Mom's first words weren't asking if Charlotte was okay. She started talking about how this scandal would ruin their reputation at the country club, and how all their friends were gossiping about us. Charlotte turned her face to the wall and wouldn't look at them. I stood up and told them to leave if they couldn't be supportive, and Dad actually tried to argue that we should think about the family's image. Security had to escort them out when I started yelling about how they'd chosen a killer over their own daughter. That same afternoon, the story broke on the local news with Mark's photo next to the headline about a doctor who murdered his wives. Within hours, reporters were calling everyone we knew trying to get interviews and photos. My phone rang non-stop until I had to turn it off completely. Mark's defense attorney went on TV that night claiming Charlotte and I had conspired to frame an innocent man for his money. He said we were gold diggers who'd planned this whole thing to get Mark's wealth, and that Charlotte had tried to kill herself when the plan went wrong. The next morning, I met with Gray Gibson, a private investigator Clarissa had recommended who specialized in cases like this. He was expensive, but he promised he could track down evidence from all the cities where Mark had lived before. He'd already started pulling records from Seattle and Boston, and found 2 more suspicious deaths that matched Mark's pattern. Gray showed me obituaries and insurance documents and medical records that painted a clear picture of a man who'd been killing women for money for over a decade. He said he'd have a full report ready for the prosecutor within a week, and that Mark wouldn't be able to explain away all of it. Charlotte's doctor came in that afternoon to explain that the digoxin levels in her blood had been high enough to stop her heart. She'd need months of cardiac monitoring to make sure there wasn't permanent damage, and she might have irregular heartbeats for the rest of her life. The medical bills were already over $50,000 and climbing every day. Mark had canceled Charlotte's health insurance without telling her, so everything was coming out of pocket. The doctor said Charlotte was lucky to be alive, and that 10 more minutes in that bathtub would have killed her for sure. Charlotte's first physical therapy session started 3 days later, and she couldn't even stand without the nurse holding her. Her legs shook like jelly, and her heart monitor started beeping crazy fast after just 2 steps. The therapist had to help her back to the wheelchair, and Charlotte just broke down sobbing right there in the hallway. She kept saying maybe it would have been better if Mark had just finished the job clean instead of leaving her like this. I grabbed her hand and told her to stop talking like that, but she just stared at the wall. That afternoon, I brought her laptop from the apartment, and we started going through her email together. There were hundreds of messages from Mark, and at first they looked normal, but then Charlotte showed me how to read between the lines. He'd write stuff about how accidents happen all the time, and how careful she needed to be crossing streets. One email talked about his first wife, and how she didn't listen to his advice about being safe. Charlotte had saved every single one in a special folder labeled recipes, so Mark wouldn't find them. She'd been collecting evidence for months while pretending everything was fine. The next morning, Clarissa called with news about Mark's bail hearing. The judge had looked at the 3 fake passports and the plane tickets Mark bought to countries without extradition treaties. Mark's parents were in the courtroom, and they started yelling when the judge denied bail completely. His mom posted all over Facebook that night calling it a witch hunt against her innocent son. Detective Matthews showed up at the hospital that afternoon with more news. Mark's assistant had agreed to cooperate with the police after they showed her the evidence. She admitted she helped forge Charlotte's signature on the insurance papers, but swore she thought it was just regular paperwork. The detective played us a recording of her crying, and saying she never knew what Mark was really doing. She thought she was helping with surprise financial planning for their future. Clarissa came by the next day to explain what would happen next with the grand jury. She said the process would take several weeks, and Charlotte would need to testify about everything. Because of Charlotte's heart problems from the poisoning, they arranged for her to give testimony through video from a secure location. Charlotte's hands shook when Clarissa explained she'd have to describe finding the evidence and why she didn't run. I spent the next week looking for an apartment for Charlotte near the hospital. Found a place on the 3rd floor with only one way in and out. I installed security cameras at the front door and in the hallway, and even put one facing the parking lot. Charlotte was too scared to be alone but too proud to ask me to stay, so I just started bringing my stuff over without asking. Set up my laptop in the living room and acted like I was just working late. She never said anything, but I could see her relax a little when I was there. One night, Charlotte finally told me when she first knew something was wrong. She'd found Tiana's medical records in Mark's home office when she was looking for printer paper. He'd kept them in a filing cabinet with notes written in the margins about drug dosages and timing. There were calculations about body weight and how long different amounts would take to work. She said her hands were shaking, so bad she could barely put the papers back. That's when she started her own documentation. Charlotte explained how Mark would test her by bringing up his dead wives during dinner. He'd watch her face to see if she looked suspicious or just sad for him. She learned to cry on command and say things about how tragic it must have been. She'd hold his hand and tell him he deserved happiness after so much loss. The whole time she was terrified he could tell she was faking. She got so good at it that Mark started calling her his angel who understood his pain. Then Charlotte showed me something that made everything else seem small. She pulled out a key to a safety deposit box at a bank across town. Inside was a journal she'd been keeping for 6 months documenting everything. Every threat Mark made disguised as a joke about accidents. Every time he mentioned how insurance was important for young couples. Every weird comment about how his other wives hadn't been careful enough. The entries went back to their third date when he'd mentioned his first wife dying. Charlotte had written down the exact words he used and the way his eyes looked when he talked about it. Some pages had photos of bruises taped to them with dates and descriptions of how she got them. She'd even recorded some of their conversations on her phone and saved the files to a cloud account Mark didn't know about. Clarissa called that evening with a warning that made my stomach drop. She said Mark's defense team would try to twist Charlotte's evidence gathering against her. They'd argue she could have left or called police instead of staying to collect proof. They might even say she was complicit, or that she let other women get hurt by not reporting him sooner. Charlotte went pale when she heard this and started breathing fast. I had to get her anxiety medication from the bathroom while Clarissa kept talking about legal strategies. The prosecutor said we needed to be ready for character attacks and victim blaming. She said Mark's lawyers were expensive and would use every trick to create reasonable doubt. The next morning, Charlotte's lawyer came to the hospital with a stack of papers and a recorder. Charlotte's hands shook as she signed forms saying she was scared Mark would hunt her down if she tried to leave him. She told the lawyer about finding news articles where 2 of Mark's exes died in car crashes and house fires after they broke up with him. The lawyer wrote everything down while Charlotte talked about how Mark would joke about accidents happening to people who crossed him. I held Charlotte's hand while she explained how he'd watch her read those articles on her phone and then ask if she felt safe. 2 days later, we met with Sienna Oates, the therapist the hospital assigned to Charlotte. Sienna sat in the chair next to Charlotte's bed and explained that what Charlotte did wasn't stupid or weak. She said Charlotte's choice to play along and gather evidence was actually really smart, given how dangerous Mark was. Sienna called it a survival strategy and said lots of abuse victims do similar things when they know running might get them killed. Charlotte cried when Sienna said she wasn't crazy for staying. That afternoon, Charlotte pulled a key from inside her phone case and pressed it into my hand. She told me about a storage unit she'd rented across town 6 months ago. Her voice was barely a whisper when she said she'd hidden copies of everything there because she was afraid Mark would find her main evidence. She admitted she thought about her funeral every single day and wanted to make sure someone would find proof if he killed her. I drove to the storage unit that same evening and used Charlotte's key to open Unit 47B. Inside were 3 big plastic bins filled with binders. Each binder was labeled with dates going back 8 months. The first one I opened had printed emails between Mark and his assistant about insurance companies. The next had photos Charlotte took of bruises on her arms and legs, with dates written on sticky notes. There were medical records she'd copied from Mark's home office and receipts she'd found in his car for medications he'd bought with cash. One whole binder was just screenshots of Mark's bank statements she'd taken pictures of when he left his laptop open. The most shocking thing was a timeline Charlotte had made on poster board. She'd mapped out when each of Mark's wives died and matched it to his job changes. Every single death happened right when Mark was starting at a new hospital or buying expensive property. She'd used red string to connect the deaths to big purchases Mark made right after getting the insurance money. I took pictures of everything with my phone and called Gray Gibson from the parking lot. Gray came to the storage unit the next morning and spent hours going through Charlotte's timeline. He pulled up public records on his laptop and found that Mark had huge debts before each wife died. The first wife's death paid off medical school loans and bought his first house. The second cleared credit card debt from failed investments. Each insurance payout wiped out whatever Mark owed with plenty left over to start fresh. Gray said the pattern was so clear that any jury would see it. While Gray worked on the financial stuff, Elliot Davenport from the hospital pharmacy was doing his own investigation. He called me 3 days later saying he'd found something huge. Mark had been signing out digoxin for patients who didn't exist for the past 6 months. Elliot had the pharmacy logs showing Mark took enough to kill someone several times over, plus extra that Elliot figured was for practice. The hospital's security cameras caught Mark going into the medication room at weird hours when he wasn't even supposed to be working. Elliot said Mark would badge in at 2 or 3 in the morning and stay for just a few minutes. The footage showed him using his keycard to access the locked cabinet where they kept the heart medications. Elliot testified in a deposition that this broke every single rule the hospital had and showed Mark was planning something for months. The same week all this evidence was coming together, our parents' lawyer sent me a certified letter. Mom and Dad were demanding I stop helping the prosecutors because it was destroying the family's reputation. The letter said they'd cut me off financially if I didn't stop cooperating. I wrote back a single sentence saying Mark destroyed the family when he tried to murder Charlotte. I never heard from them again. Clarissa called Charlotte the next day with good news. The prosecutor's office was offering Charlotte a cooperation agreement that would protect her from any charges about not reporting Mark sooner. Charlotte signed it right there in the hospital bed, and for the first time in months, I saw her shoulders relax. She'd been so scared they'd blame her for knowing about Mark's plans and not calling the police. Clarissa explained that victims often know something's wrong but are too scared or controlled to report it. The agreement meant Charlotte could tell the whole truth without worrying about getting in trouble herself. 3 days later, Detective Matthews called with news that made my stomach drop. Mark's assistant had been sending Charlotte's insurance papers through fake email accounts she'd set up at Mark's request. She sat in the police station crying as she explained how Mark told her it was for surprise retirement planning, and that Charlotte would be so happy when she found out. The detective showed me printouts of dozens of emails where the assistant thought she was helping plan a wonderful future, but was actually helping Mark set up Charlotte's murder. The FBI showed up at my apartment the next morning with badges and serious faces. They'd connected Mark to 2 more dead wives in states we hadn't even looked at yet. One woman in Oregon died in a car accident after her brakes failed, and another in Florida drowned in her pool after taking sleeping pills she never had a prescription for. Both had million-dollar policies Mark collected on. The agent spent hours going through my research and said this was now a federal case since Mark crossed state lines to commit his crimes. Mark's lawyer filed papers trying to keep the other deaths out of Charlotte's trial. He argued it would make the jury hate Mark for things that weren't related to Charlotte's case. Clarissa worked 18-hour days for 3 weeks straight preparing her response. She had boxes of evidence delivered to her office and barely went home. I brought her dinner most nights and watched her build the case that these deaths showed Mark's pattern. The judge's ruling came on a Thursday morning. He said the other deaths could be presented because they showed Mark's method and motive. Mark's lawyer immediately filed an appeal, but the higher court said the ruling would stand. Clarissa actually smiled for the first time in weeks. A reporter from the biggest paper in the state called Charlotte at the hospital. She said she wanted to tell Charlotte's story the right way, focusing on how she survived instead of making it into some cheap thriller. Charlotte thought about it for 2 days before agreeing to one interview with her face hidden and voice changed. The interview lasted 4 hours, and Charlotte had to take breaks to catch her breath and stop shaking. Gray found something that made Charlotte cry harder than I'd seen since the wedding. Mark had been draining her bank accounts for months by getting her to sign papers he said were for joint investments. She'd lost almost $200,000 her grandmother left her. The money was gone, moved through so many accounts that Gray said we'd probably never get it back. Charlotte just stared at the bank statements and whispered that her grandmother would be so disappointed. The Financial Crimes Unit froze the $1 million insurance payout the same day. They also found 3 offshore accounts in Mark's name with money from his dead wives. The total was over $4 million sitting in banks in countries that don't send money back to the U.S. The prosecutor said at least Mark wouldn't get Charlotte's money even if we couldn't get the other victims' money back. Mark's lawyer came to Clarissa with an offer 2 weeks before the trial date. 40 years in prison with a chance for parole when Mark was 70. Clarissa called Charlotte and me to her office to discuss it. Charlotte didn't even let Clarissa finish explaining before she said no. She wanted Mark to face trial for all of them, not just her. She wanted the other families to see him get what he deserved. Sienna started working with Charlotte every day to get ready for testifying. They practiced Charlotte telling her story without her mind going blank or floating away like it did when she remembered the worst parts. Charlotte would sit in Sienna's office and practice saying Mark's name without shaking. She practiced talking about finding the obituaries without losing her voice. Sienna said Charlotte was the strongest person she'd ever worked with, but Charlotte didn't believe her. I found a support group for families of attempted murder survivors that met in a church basement on Tuesday nights. The first meeting I just sat and listened to other people talk about their guilt. One woman said she should have seen the signs before her daughter's boyfriend tried to kill her. Another man talked about not protecting his wife from her stalker. When I finally talked, I said I should have done more to save Charlotte sooner. The group leader, a woman whose own sister survived a murder attempt, told me that guilt was normal, but not fair to myself. She said predators like Mark are experts at hiding and manipulating everyone around their victims. She said I did save Charlotte by never giving up even when everyone turned against me. The other people in the group nodded, and one man said I was a hero for fighting so hard. I didn't feel like a hero, but it helped to hear that my guilt wasn't my fault. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived from Mom with a check for $5,000 and a note about moving forward and putting this behind us. Charlotte ripped the note in half without reading the rest, and we used the money for her heart medication that insurance wouldn't cover. Gray called that afternoon with something that made me drop my phone. He'd found documents where Mark forged Charlotte's signature, making himself the person who'd decide about her organs if she died. The papers were dated 3 weeks before the wedding and filed with the hospital where Mark worked. Gray said the forgery was obvious when compared to Charlotte's real signature, but Mark must have counted on her being dead before anyone checked. Detective Matthews came by the next day to tell us Mark's assistant had agreed to testify against him for immunity. She'd been crying through her whole recorded statement about helping him get the insurance papers signed without Charlotte knowing. The detective played us part of the recording where she kept saying she couldn't believe she helped him hurt all those women. Elliot called me while Charlotte was in therapy to say his audit of the hospital pharmacy turned up something bad. Mark had been checking out digoxin to test on lab rats in the research wing after hours. The security cameras showed him going into the lab with the drugs, and the dead rats were found in the medical waste with digoxin in their systems. Elliot had charts showing Mark tested different amounts on rats of different weights to figure out the right dose for a person. The hospital board was meeting that night to discuss their failure to catch Mark stealing drugs for 15 years. 2 weeks later, jury selection started and both lawyers fought over every single person. Mark's lawyer didn't want anyone who'd experienced domestic violence, and Clarissa didn't want anyone who thought doctors could do no wrong. They went through almost 200 people before finding 12 jurors and 4 alternates who both sides could accept. The judge had to call in extra jury pools from neighboring counties because they'd run out of people. Charlotte had to be there every day even though she couldn't testify yet, and I watched her hands shake whenever Mark looked at her. The opening statements finally began 3 weeks after that. Clarissa stood in front of the jury with a stack of death certificates and started laying out the pattern. She showed them photos of 7 women who'd married Mark and died within 2 years. She put up a chart of the insurance policies with the dates and amounts, and Charlotte's name at the bottom with attempted, written in red. She didn't raise her voice or get dramatic, but just let the facts tell the story. Mark's lawyer tried to say it was all coincidence and Charlotte was a troubled woman who'd tried to kill herself, but even he didn't sound like he believed it. The first witness was the medical examiner from Seattle who'd looked at Mark's second wife's autopsy reports. She put slides on the screen showing the woman's injuries weren't from falling downstairs like the original report said. The wounds on her head came from being hit with something flat and heavy, and there were defensive wounds on her hands. She'd also found traces of a sedative in the woman's blood that wasn't mentioned in the first autopsy. The examiner said someone had pushed the woman down the stairs after drugging her and hitting her with something like a book or a board. An insurance investigator took the stand next to explain how Mark had gamed the system. He'd space out the applications over months and use different companies each time so nothing triggered an automatic review. He knew exactly how much coverage he could get without raising red flags, and he always waited at least 6 months after marriage to take out the policies. The investigator had found applications where Mark forged signatures going back 12 years across 5 states. Each policy paid out within 2 years of being issued, and Mark had collected over $6 million total. Elliot testified on day 4 about the pharmacy breaches. He showed the jury Mark's signature on forms for patients who didn't exist, and security footage of Mark in the pharmacy at 3 in the morning. He explained how Mark had used his department head access to override the normal checks, and how he'd been stealing drugs for years without anyone catching him. The defense lawyer tried to say maybe Mark was doing legitimate research, but Elliot showed there were no research protocols filed and no approval from the ethics board. He also showed the jury photos of the dead rats with Mark's handwriting on the cages, noting doses and times of death. Then it was Charlotte's turn. She walked to the witness stand so slowly I thought she might pass out before she got there. Clarissa started with easy questions about how she met Mark and their early relationship. Charlotte's voice was barely above a whisper when she described finding the obituary of his first wife hidden in his desk. She'd been looking for a pen and found a folder marked with a woman's name she didn't recognize. Inside were newspaper clippings about the woman's death and a copy of the insurance payout check. Charlotte said she knew right then she was going to die if she didn't play along perfectly. She told the jury how she started recording Mark on her phone whenever he talked about his dead wives. She'd sewn a USB drive into her wedding dress because she knew that might be her last chance to leave evidence. She described finding his notes about digoxin doses and copying them when he was at work. She knew he was going to poison her but didn't know when, and she couldn't run because he'd told her about 2 ex-girlfriends who died in car accidents after leaving him. The defense lawyer tried to make it seem like Charlotte could have just called the police, but she explained that Mark had friends everywhere. He'd already turned her parents against me and made everyone think I was crazy and drunk. She'd tried to leave hints for me to find but couldn't risk being obvious or Mark would know she was onto him. Charlotte broke down crying when she described drinking the champagne at the wedding, knowing it might be poisoned but hoping I'd see the signs in time. The defense lawyer stood up and started asking Charlotte if she could have just walked out the door anytime she wanted. Charlotte's hands shook on the witness stand as she tried to explain how Mark would follow her everywhere and had told her about 2 ex-girlfriends who died in car crashes after they left him. The lawyer kept pushing, saying she had a phone and could have called for help, but Charlotte just kept shaking her head and crying. That's when Sienna took the stand to explain how trauma bonding works and why victims can't just leave when someone has that much control over them. She showed the jury charts about psychological manipulation and explained how Mark had isolated Charlotte from everyone who could help her. The defense lawyer tried to argue with her, but Sienna had studies and research backing up everything she said. Clarissa asked Sienna gentle questions on redirect that helped the jury understand Charlotte wasn't weak or stupid. She was trapped by someone who knew exactly how to control people. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with my folder of evidence even though the prosecutor already had copies of everything. I told them about finding the bruises on Charlotte's arm and how Mark said it was from tennis when Charlotte had never played tennis in her life. I described finding the insurance paperwork and how I'd begged my parents to listen, but they thought I was jealous of Charlotte's perfect boyfriend. The jury looked angry when I told them about the country club where Charlotte screamed at me to get out, but her eyes were begging me to save her. I explained how I'd spent every penny I had on a private investigator and how I'd called police departments in 3 states trying to get someone to listen. The defense lawyer stood up and said I was just a jealous sister who couldn't stand that Charlotte had found someone successful. He brought up the rumors Mark had spread about me being a drunk and asked why the jury should believe someone with a drinking problem. Clarissa jumped up and asked me directly if I'd ever had a drink in my life. I told them I don't drink because alcoholism runs in our family, and I watched my uncle destroy his life with it, so I've never touched alcohol ever. The defense lawyer's face turned red when Clarissa showed records from my job requiring drug and alcohol testing that I'd passed every single time for 5 years. She also had statements from 20 people saying they'd never seen me drink anything stronger than coffee. Mark's assistant took the stand next, looking like she wanted to throw up. She played the voicemail where Mark asked her to rush Charlotte's life insurance paperwork because time was running short, and he needed it done before the wedding. The jury members looked at each other when they heard Mark's voice saying Charlotte wouldn't need to know about the policy until it was too late to matter. The assistant cried as she explained she thought he meant too late to get a better rate, not too late because Charlotte would be dead. She said she'd helped with insurance paperwork for his other wives too and never questioned why a doctor needed so much life insurance on women who didn't work. She showed the jury emails where Mark told her to use different insurance companies each time and to space out the applications, so nothing would flag in the system. Clarissa's closing argument took 2 hours as she laid out every piece of evidence like a puzzle coming together. She showed the timeline of 7 dead wives and 7 insurance payouts, and asked the jury what the odds were of that being coincidence. She played the recording of Mark talking about Charlotte not lasting past the honeymoon, and showed the pharmacy records of him stealing enough digoxin to kill someone Charlotte's weight. She reminded them about the bruises and the weight loss, and how Charlotte was dying in front of everyone while Mark played the perfect boyfriend. The defense lawyer tried to argue that Mark was a respected doctor who saved lives, and that we'd created this story for attention and money. He said Charlotte could have left any time and that she chose to stay, so she must not have been that scared. He tried to say the other wives' deaths were tragic accidents, and that Mark was just unlucky in love. The jury went to deliberate, and we sat in the hallway waiting. Charlotte grabbed my hand so tight I thought she might break my fingers, but I didn't pull away. 6 hours later, they called us back in. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreman stood up with a paper in his hand. Guilty on attempted murder. Guilty on insurance fraud. Guilty on 7 counts of murder in the first degree. Charlotte made a sound like a wounded animal and collapsed against me as the judge kept reading guilty over and over. Mark's face never changed. Just that same calm expression he'd had at the country club when I confronted him about Tiana. 2 weeks later at sentencing, the judge called Mark a predator who used his medical knowledge to hunt women for money. He gave him consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole, saying someone who could kill 7 women and almost kill an 8th would never be safe to release. Charlotte finally took a full breath for the first time since she'd met Mark. The families of Mark's other victims filed civil suits the next week, and the court combined them into one big case. Mark's assets would be sold to pay damages to all the families he'd destroyed. The Victim Compensation Fund approved Charlotte's application to cover her medical bills and therapy costs. The hospital settled out of court for their failure to monitor Mark's access to drugs, giving Charlotte enough money to start over. The reporters stopped calling after a few weeks when another scandal took over the news cycle. Charlotte and I both changed our phone numbers and deleted our social media accounts, grateful to disappear back into normal life where no one knew our story. 3 weeks passed before the mediator's letter arrived in my mailbox with our parents' names at the bottom, asking if Charlotte and I would consider family counseling together. Charlotte read it twice before setting it on the kitchen counter and saying she wasn't ready, but maybe someday, which felt like the first crack in the wall between us and them. The mediator called every 2 weeks after that, and Charlotte started taking the calls instead of letting them go to voicemail, and I could hear her voice getting less angry each time. 6 months crawled by with Charlotte going to therapy 3 times a week and taking new medications that made her hands shake but helped her sleep more than 2 hours at a time. The therapist finally convinced our parents to come for a structured conversation where they had to follow specific rules about what they could and couldn't say to us. Mom cried through her whole apology about not believing me when I showed her the evidence, and Dad kept clearing his throat as he admitted they'd been so focused on Charlotte marrying well that they ignored every warning sign. They signed up for their own therapy to figure out why they'd chosen Mark over their own daughters, and the therapist said that was a good first step toward maybe fixing things someday. Charlotte started spending Tuesday mornings at the domestic violence shelter downtown, helping other women fill out restraining order paperwork and recognize the warning signs she'd lived through herself. The shelter director said Charlotte had a gift for making scared women feel safe enough to tell their stories, and asked if she'd consider leading a support group once she felt ready. My boss called me into her office the week after I got back from all the trial time off, and said she'd followed the case in the news and admired how I'd never given up on Charlotte. She promoted me to senior analyst with a $20,000 raise that meant I could help Charlotte pay for her apartment while she figured out what came next with her life. We spent a weekend going through all the court documents and newspaper articles about Mark's other victims to find their family's contact information. The lawyer helped us set up a small scholarship fund in their memory for women going into medical or legal fields, with the first scholarship going to a girl from Seattle whose aunt was Mark's second victim. Our parents started coming to dinner once a month with strict rules about not mentioning Mark or the trial, or asking when Charlotte would start dating again or get a real job. The first dinner lasted 40 minutes before Charlotte had to leave the room, but by the 4th one we made it through dessert, and Dad even laughed at something that wasn't forced or uncomfortable. Charlotte called me at 6 in the morning on a random Tuesday to tell me she'd slept 8 hours straight without waking up screaming or checking the locks, or thinking Mark was standing in her bedroom doorway. Her therapist said it was a breakthrough that meant her brain was finally starting to process the trauma as something that happened in the past, instead of something still happening right now. I bought a filing cabinet with a lock for all the evidence and trial documents and put it in my spare bedroom closet where I hoped it would stay forever, but knew I'd keep it just in case. Every Sunday morning, Charlotte came over for breakfast, and we'd make pancakes and talk about anything except Mark, and slowly we stopped being the girl who almost died, and the sister who saved her, and started just being us again. Thanks for letting me question things right alongside you. It's been a ride just wondering together. Until next time, take care out there. Like the video, it helps more than you think.